Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's APA Live event. I'm Amy Ferrer, the Executive Director of the American Philosophical Association. And thanks so much for joining us today. Today's event is titled Splendor of Gender, Gen Z's Perspectives on Changing the Meaning of Gender. And this has been co-organized by the APA Virtual Programming Committee and the Philosophy Learning and Teaching organization at Plato. For a few sentences of context before we get into the panel, I'll now turn things over to Stephen Miller, who is the chair of the APA Committee on Pre-College Philosophy. Stephen.
Thank you, Amy, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I just want to give some brief context to this, that I am the chair of the APA's Committee on Pre-College Instruction and Philosophy. I'm also on the executive committee of Plato. And last summer, Plato set up what's called the Student Advisory Council. And it now consists of 6 students from around the country who are both interested in providing content like tonight, and also are really our main goal in both the APA committee and in the Student Advisory Council is trying to find a way to bring the benefits of philosophy to students that aren't able to get that. These 6 students tonight have had a great experience of being involved with philosophy, and as you'll hear, they have a very sophisticated understanding of it, but most students in high school don't get any of that. And so the goal of this advisory council is to take these kinds of things and help bring it wider to a wider audience, to bring philosophy into outside of the traditional academic setting, and especially into high schools and middle schools. I'm going to turn it over to them. This is their show. And so Kishi, if you want to take it away. Thanks so much.
All right, so we're just going to start with a round of introductions for all the panelists and the chair. To start, I'm Kishi. I'm a panelist here. I go to Oakwood Friends School in Poughkeepsie, New York. I'm an 11th grader, and my pronouns are they, them.
I'm Zoe. I'm a senior. I go to Oakwood Friends School in Poughkeepsie, and my pronouns are she, they.
Hi, everyone. My name is Madeline. I go to Lincoln High School in Seattle, and I'm a junior. My pronouns are she, her.
Hello, my name is Charles. I go to the LFSF in San Francisco, and my pronouns are he, him.
Hi, my name is Anna Maria. I am from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I attend the Academy at Colombo, and I'm in 11th grade, and my pronouns are she, her.
Hi, my name is Ori. I also go to Oakwood Friends School and am a senior, and my pronouns are they, them, and I'm also the chair. And now we're going to go into more of what our personal pronouns mean to us. Personally, I just recently changed my pronouns in the last couple months because my whole life I've felt disconnected from the standard like masculine ideas, and it took me a while to realize that, and just recently I've really come to terms with that, and so I've changed my name and pronouns. And whoever wants to go next can just speak up.
My pronouns are also they, them. I came out in middle school, and that's also around the time I started questioning. I sort of don't feel like I fit in any neatly in any sort of category. The thing I feel like most comfortable about in my identity is my pronouns, because it's it feels like the most useful thing to me, because it is how it's important to how people interact with me and understand me socially. And then beyond that, I kind of leave my gender undefined.
Yeah, I'd say for me, it's really a status, I guess, like a way other people see you. So especially you do it with introductions and when introducing yourself, I think it really, I guess, gives people an image, because there are definitely stereotypes that comes with each group. And so just putting forward like what group you are a part of, I guess, is really the most important part to me. It really represents, I guess, who I am.
I would say that my pronouns personally, the reason I kind of use the ones I do is very functional, I guess. It's just that like I feel like they most accurately represent the way I feel about my gender, which is that, you know, I don't really feel uncomfortable with, you know, she, her, or like womanhood, but I also, especially as I get like more and more, as I do more and more classes that have to do with like gender theory and things like this, I kind of realized that I don't necessarily feel like they're the only pronouns that define me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, my pronouns, I really like what Zoe said about how pronouns like can like they're not uncomfortable, you know. I've kind of been like I haven't put a lot of thought into my pronouns, and I think that's one of the privileges that I have as a cis woman right now. To just like kind of think of my pronouns and my gender like as something secondary to my identity. But yeah, I definitely think that like part of the reason that my pronouns are she, her is because I haven't like put a ton of thought into what my pronouns are right now.
I definitely understand what Madeline was saying, and I feel like that a lot of people can also relate to that. So it's like in terms of my pronoun she, her, like previously before I was able to get the experience to be on this youth advisory council and talk a bit more, talk a bit more about like the philosophy of gender and like how as society we view it. It isn't, in all honesty, it wasn't something that I put a lot of thought about, but I feel like now, especially being a part of Gen Z and interacting with different people and hearing about different experiences and kind of how their pronouns play a role in their gender and their identity, it really like has opened my mind up a lot. And I just feel like I use she, her pronouns because like ever since I was little, I guess it's something that I connect with. Like Madeline said, I have the privilege as a cis woman to like not necessarily be at odds or like uncomfortable with those pronouns, but like I still, kind of like think deeply of it. And when I think more about the pronouns and the pronouns I use, the more I think it's like kind of how it really is a social construct that was kind of like designed by society in order to like categorize people, which is something that we're going to get a lot more into within our webinar today. So yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think continuing on what Anna Maria said, I think we should continue on the social construct nature of gender, but also just to everyone in the audience, please feel free to put any questions in the chat. We will have an open Q&A time later. So yeah, does anyone want to start with social constructivism?
So yeah, I think this is an idea to just sort of talk about and get out of the way quick, because we're going to sort of be referring to gender in this sort of framework of the idea that gender is a social construct. And so to explain what that means, we're going to use a definition by Ian Hacking from The Social Construction of What, where basically a social construct, the idea of it is that X social construct need not have existed or need not be at all. X as it is at present is not determined by the nature of things. It is not inevitable. So basically, it's not a natural kind, and it's also not something produced by any like way of human minds or anything like that. We often go on to say that X social construct is bad as it is and should be changed or eliminated. But that's not necessarily always the case. So yeah, we're talking about gender as it is, like something that humans have sort of invented over the years, and is not like, it's not the same thing as sex, and it's not always fixed, essentially.
Yeah, one part of that definition of a social construct that I find really interesting when talking about gender as a social construct is, I think the first premise of that argument is quite convincing, that gender not have always existed. As we have seen it, gender be so different for so many different cultures throughout history and even in modern society. Although I think gender definitely had, something worth mentioning is that gender definitely has become much more uniform with colonialism over the years, and as European nations have tried to colonize a lot of the rest of the world, they have gotten rid or tried to eradicate certain ideas of gender, or tried to push a more binary agenda on a lot of other languages and cultures. Yeah, so one example of this that I actually just learned from a friend this morning was that some dialects in Chinese used to only have one pronoun for people regardless of their gender. But when European, I think British colonizers came in, they actually tried to change that and make it so that there were separate pronouns for feminine and masculine people.
And I think that also illustrates one of the other really important things about gender, like talking about it as a social construct, is that that doesn't mean that it's not real, and that it still has like material consequences, and like it very much is a real thing. It's just only real because everyone on some level agrees that it is.
Yeah.
But the initial reaction to be like, oh, but it is a real thing, is also, it's true, because we're not saying it's fake in that sense.
Yeah, and it's this this sort of, it definitely has this fact called the looping effect, where like social constructs and stereotypes and any sort of like idea of produced by humans about other humans tends to, like, as it spreads and as it like sinks into like the consciousness of society, it tends to actually like reinforce itself. So like the idea that women behave a certain way, once it's posited, will begin to reinforce itself, regardless of whether it's actually true or not. And
I think the easiest way to like understand the difference between gender and sex is really gender is not sex in and of itself. It's the roles that we attributed to sex, but that didn't always apply to sex. And so that's kind of why gender these days especially is much more pronounced, because we realize that the normal stereotypes we use to define what was the two sexes is now starting to apply. It doesn't apply to that. And so gender kind of combats those stereotypes.
yeah, it's, sorry, do you want?
I just think that stereotypes are a really important aspect when you look at like gender and sex and like the difference between the two, because like, for example, but at birth, and this is kind of wraps into exactly how it is a social contract, is because like for the, I guess like the female gender, there was stereotypes created. It was like, oh, like women must like the color pink, or women must behave a certain way, or women wear dresses and skirts, and we like see it every day. It's kind of become like subconscious because it's so engraved within our society. We see it in media, we see it and all the way dating back to like elementary school, when we're split into girls lines and boys lines. And also when on the other side with men as well, it's like men need to follow the traditional masculine traits. But like what's really important is like us as a society to try and be able to like separate, to like try and see that it is a social construct and it's not just what society deems it to be.
It's also, I think, sorry, or
Oh, I was just gonna say, it's important to realize that sex also isn't a binary. Is that what you were gonna talk about?
I was going to talk about that a little bit. Yeah. I also, yeah. So this is something people are usually familiar with, the fact that gender is a social construct, but sometimes the idea that sex is a social construct can sort of trip them up. Sex, like as a binary, and even like biological sex as a very unified, defined thing, is also not actually sort of reflective of like scientific fact, right? Because essentially, I mean, intersex people exist, right? They make up some portion of the population, and therefore, because there are people who don't fit into a sex binary, there is no sex binary, because once there's something outside of that, the binary disappears. And then also like various factors actually go into one's biological sex that can change it. Someone can be like chromosomally male, but not anatomically male. They can be hormonally male, but not or they can be anatomically male but not hormonally male, and they can be hormonally male but not reproduce in the way we would expect male people to.
And just adding on more about intersex people, there's a similar way that societal norms are enforced on intersex people at birth. Most of them, their sex is just chosen by their doctors or parents at that moment of birth, and it's generally not really considerate to the actual intersex people, and they grow up with very mixed feelings because of that, like, binary that has been forced upon them at birth, similar to gender expression.
Yeah, I was gonna say we've been kind of talking about a lot of ideas that Judith Butler specifically, or is how at least I first read about them. And I think that Judith Butler's idea of gender as something that kind of, it has this fallacy where it asserts itself as like it's proof that it's real, is just the symptoms of it in a way. Like, because people agree that gender's real, for example, they like put little girls in pink dresses for an obvious example, and then people go, oh wow, girls really love pink dresses. And the same effect kind of does happen with like the sex binary, and that, yeah, like intersex kids, for example, are, just chosen, like a gender is chosen for them, or a biological sex is chosen for them in a way that kind of creates the societal effect of that people think, oh, that's really rare, and the binary does exist, just because the binary is actively getting rid of things that don't, that interfere with it.
Yeah, so I thought it was, I really like this conversation that we're having about like the gender binary and like the sex binary, and what people, like what society has tried to put gender and sex, both gender and sex, like into these binaries. And I think that kind of goes along with Hacking's second premise that like the way that society perceives both gender and sex is like in the way like effectively is quite bad as it is, like at least, yeah, it's like still now, like there's a lot of problems with the way that the vast majority of society still perceives gender and sex. So I'm kind of wondering whether like what do we think about three, like the third premise, that would it be better if gender or sex as we know it now would be done away with or radically transformed, in what ways?
Yeah, and that's something that Simone de Beauvoir posited. She sort of, in her book, The Second Sex, talked about, she's like a very sort of revolutionary gender theorist at her time, and talked about basically how gender roles are super oppressive, and how they make, combined with heteronormativity, make just like terrible oppressive relationships between men and women, due to the cycle of like trying to, basically that women are socially objectified all the time, and like men are elevated to the status of human while women are basically left as just objects for the service of men, and how them being human beings, that doesn't really work. And said that due to that system, we should just basically do away with gender and live in an androgynous society. And the way she put it, it does sound great, like basically raising children without like the conception of gender, or no like limitations on what they can do based on their gender, and all of that. But personally, I think that we're not really at like a stage in society where we can do that, especially because it's sort of, and this was an issue with Simone de Beauvoir, she doesn't really, even though she's revolutionary author about gender, doesn't really take into account transgender individuals. And gender, even though it can be oppressive both to cisgender and transgender people, the sort of coding and language of gender, which is something that Judith Butler discusses, it can be helpful, basically, for people to transition, and for people who feel comfortable about like genders that aren't the gender they are assigned at birth. They need like some means to communicate that gender when it's not as accessible to them to do that as it would be for a cis person. So for that reason, I think that like maybe abolishing gender as we are is not the right path right now. But just like having more, I guess, nuanced conversations like this about it is a great step forward.
And I think one of the most important things that Beauvoir talked about was the separation of sex and gender. I think a lot of people get it confused. There's like the common saying like, oh, well, if you don't know what your gender is, just kind of look down, all of that. Like, I think people really do mix the two up because we're rarely given an exact definition of gender, and that's because there basically is none. But I think Beauvoir really makes it clear that the sex is natural, and even then never says it's binary, although she does not go on to the topic of transgender. But she really talked about how gender is constructed by society, and so you need to make sure to separate the two because they are not the same thing.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. No, you can talk.
Oh, I was just going to move us on to a new question, but if you have something to say about this, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think the biggest problem with it, I think that the idea of establishing an androgynous society, if it could be done, I feel like, there is something to be said about the fact that gender does cause like it is like in a lot of circumstances, mostly a tool of oppression. However, I think the problem is like with socially constructed things like gender, that means that like there isn't really a way to like outlaw it because it still like lives on mentally, like in the individual. People aren't just going to forget that it exists or just decide that they don't believe in it anymore. Even people who like don't believe in gender now, there's an extent to which like you're raised in a society that's constantly the feedback loop of just input telling you that it's a real thing and that these are the attributes of one gender and this is the other gender, and people aren't going to be able to just unknow that because society decides to move on. And I think that's kind of the problem with that question, is that like on the surface that sounds like a great idea, but I'm not sure it really gets us anywhere.
Yeah, and it's sort of it is like kind of comparable to like ideas of like approaching race and other social construct with like color blindness to solve racial issues. Like that's not going to fix anything.
Yeah, kind of just to add, like I think in terms of gender, it really is systemic in a sense because with kind of all aspects of oppression, because of the fact that it's been like so engraved within society and like the way that we function with society, that it's just like it definitely can be like hard to separate. So like for example, structurally within our system in America, there are still gender pay gaps, and similar with that with race as well. So I think Zoe's point is like really true in terms of it's definitely hard to completely like deconstruct what took like years of society constructing, but like it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and that we shouldn't like have our blinders on, but we should now that we know and now that we have more information and are opening up the conversation and are recognizing the issue, that we talk about it, and that so that we can basically all see it exist.
Yeah, I think Judith Butler talks about where they coined the term gender trouble. I think is lovely. That's just essentially like messing with established ideas of gender with how you present yourself and how you sort of express and experience gender in the world. And I think that through that and letting that become more prevalent and letting that become more like normal and accepted in culture is sort of the most feasible way we have to like reaching if not an androgynous society, then something that is like less oppressive in how gender like exists.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also am partial to the gender trouble solution because I think it makes the most sense to me, and I think it kind of takes advantage of the problem with social constructs that would make it impossible to just outlaw gender. It takes advantage of the fact that those things are arbitrary and they can change over time. And so for the same reason that they were able to be created over time and everyone just agrees on them, it makes a lot of sense to me and seems very plausible that we could just, in the same way, kind of undo them by, on an individual level, just messing with gender. Because I think we don't even necessarily have a concept of what androgyny would be without the gender binary. So I think it's best to start with just like messing with gender itself.
Yeah, I really like the idea of like gender trouble, not only because of all the reasons that you guys said, but also because I think it does a really good job of like accommodating to what both like cis and trans people might want out of gender, which is just like really a celebration of like how people want to present themselves in terms of like femininity or masculinity or androgyny.
Androgyny.
Yeah, that one. Or like however that may look like to each person and each culture and each part of each society. I think causing gender trouble or like really just celebrating gender and gender presentation in any ways, it's going to be much easier for many people to do. And I think a lot of what a lot of what's talked about when when trans people transition is like, oh, before they transition they had like a lot of gender dysphoria, but another thing that happens when you like really find the gender that suits you is gender euphoria. And I think that that's something that both trans and cis people should focus on more. And I think by causing gender trouble, like the focus on gender euphoria, it would just be like gender happiness, and it would be like better for everyone.
And I think a slight issue with the idea of an androgynous society is because people create a false equivalence between sex and gender. They think it's the same, not the same thing, but because the terms used to denote sex and gender are the same, she can mean gender, but it can also mean their sex. So pronouns, especially that aren't necessarily well adapted, people will never forget gender because to them it is sex. And I think until you get past that, that hurdle, you can't really create an androgynous society.
Yeah, I think, sorry, we are almost at the halfway point, so I think it's probably a good time to officially open questions. People have any?
Yeah, I mean, starting off with some questions. So what do us as students wish that teachers knew or did differently regarding gender in classrooms? I think, everyone's experience is different. Like personally, I know for myself, a lot of my teachers were very accepting of my new gender identity when I came out, but like, I think that is most likely the exception and not the rule.
Yeah, I would say my school, at least that I can think of personally, as someone who, especially in school, I usually do just go with she, her because it's easier and I don't mind it. I've never personally had issues, but I do know that at a lot of schools, it's all of the classic things of, misgendering or like, I don't know. Would anyone else like to speak on this one?
Yeah, like it does depend. It depends. I've been fortunate enough to have like very kind of progressive schools that have like generally good approaches to students and gender. That said, I've still been misgendered so much. Just because I don't know, it's like even though they, them singular is a pronoun that exists very prevalently in the English language, and people often use it unconsciously to refer to things and people all the time. It's like when they're referring directly to a person, they tend to have trouble just like remembering or like connecting it in their minds. It's, I think, just a matter of, I guess, one, it's getting used to it. I've been lucky to not have like a teacher who's like doesn't use my proper pronouns because they hate me and think that non-binary people don't exist. but I think that's all the more reason why like people should. I don't know where I'm gonna go with that actually. Anna Maria, did you want to talk?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. And I think it's really important that we talk about how we approach gender and the binary within school. So I come from an underfunded public school in inner city Philadelphia, and we just got gender neutral bathrooms this year, like just this year. And honestly, like I feel like that's kind of messed up because it doesn't seem to be a priority, because I bet like this, my school isn't the only one who faces this issue. Gender neutral bathrooms weren't also available in like the 8 years that I spent at my previous school before I entered high school. And I feel like that's just another aspect that we see that we need to combat in order to make a more inclusive society where everyone feels that, you know, they're comfortable and they're accepted, because everyone has the right to that and everyone should be entitled to that. And I feel like if we approach it in schools and we recognize the issue with schools, and also kind of like give training to teachers as well, because within my school there have been instances of teachers not really being that considerate or conscious in terms of the way that students identify themselves. So I think that like, because what we are taught and kind of the way that we interpret information, a lot of it does come from our schools. I think it is really important for us to be able to like open up the conversation, make the environment much more inclusive, so that the future generations and students can take that information and then implement that within society once they leave school as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that everyone's been saying. I think that for what teachers can do, like obviously the most important thing and like something that should really be like baseline, everyone does it, is like don't misgender your students. Like a very like this is like the bare minimum, you know. But like once we get like once we're past that, I feel like something that teachers should try to focus on is doing what they can to not force gender roles in any way, shape, or form onto these young students. Yeah, I think that yeah, anything that you do that like really talks about I think gender is important to talk about, and I think that you need to have conversations about gender, but conversations about gender should be like gender things should be for conversations and discussions about gender, and you don't necessarily need to put them on really any other thing. Like I know in elementary school there was a lot of like boys versus girls, and like I don't know if people are still doing that today, but if they are, that's like obviously a big no.
Yeah, and to go a little deeper into that, I think something that we'll often see is, even though there's like on an individual basis, people are like good at using people may be good at using proper pronouns and like being kind and creating safe spaces and such. It's not always like infrastructurally there in like, you know, gendered dorm rooms and gendered bathrooms. And that's sort of like a step that people have a harder time taking. And I think that on the topic of like gendering students and gender roles for students in the classroom, like I think that there is, even though, you know, it's 2022 and we're in the future, there's still like totally like this just subconscious bias that everyone has against like feminine people in academics, and this sort of like you know, even at the most progressive school there can still be like a sense of like feeling more nervous, feeling less confident, feeling like there's less room for you to speak as an AFAB or femme presenting person.
Additionally, not to spend way too long on this question, but
A long time, sorry.
Madeline, oh wait, also, were you gonna talk some more? I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I was just
Okay. Madeline also kind of made me think of that there is, I think, one of the biggest roadblocks, at least right now, in making moves towards not necessarily gender abolition, but like a more healthy, I guess, general relationship with it, is that there's such a gap in understanding of what gender actually is. Like we've kind of been talking about the whole time, but like for a lot of people, that basic fact of that gender is socially constructed and not a set in stone, thing we're born with, is not like a fact that they accept as real. And it's very hard to have a conversation about how to proceed when everyone can't agree on like the basic facts. And then on top of that, there's that some people think of sex as very binary, even if they understand that gender isn't, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think just as a baseline, I mean, it's basically all been said, but just openness and acceptance, I think, is just what you need to start off with. Because once you give an environment that people feel like they can question themselves in and they have space to do so, that's when you can get, I guess, some progress and people don't feel like closed in and alone.
yeah, totally.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to wrap that up. Again, everyone in the audience, please feel free to add any questions you have in the chat. We would love to answer them. But moving on to the next question, for those of us who have changed our names or pronouns, like how does that change how we relate to a past version of ourselves? And do our memories and stories of ourselves change because of that? I'll just, start off talking like myself. I think I do. I mean, I initially, especially when my brother first came out as trans, I initially wanted to separate the two. Like there is a past gendered self and a present and future gendered self. But I think really what this is all about is you've always been that person. I look back at myself and I've always been non-binary. I just haven't always accepted it or thought about it or really explored that in any way. So like you are the same person. So the stories and memories you have of yourselves doesn't fundamentally change once you kind of go past that. But that's just my personal experience.
Yeah, totally. And I think it is like a common misconception that like all trans people feel the need to burn the idea of their past self. Like some people like definitely experience that. But I think that there's also like there can be a sort of for me personally, I was a very like feminine little child growing up. And I try to like reckon with the idea that I'm like transmasculine now, but was a very like girly kid. And I think that like one conceptions of gender and like what their connotations are definitely change. I think like is interesting that like the conception of being a girl is different from the conception of being a woman. And like even though they both have like a through line of like femininity, like the ways that it is expected to be presented in society are different. And I think that womanhood can in theory be more oppressive, just because we also feel like children, we also feel more comfortable with like androgyny in children, and so like gender is like in some ways less enforced. And I think that that's sort of tied to the fact that children aren't sexually mature, and then it's just a byproduct of how we tie sex and gender together. But I'm digressing? I'm digressing. I think that like there is for me a little bit of a disconnect, because child me and present me had such like different feelings about femininity and masculinity. But it's not like that was a different person. It's just that like, and this is something that I think gender, even if the gender you were assigned at birth has like been something that you've been like felt okay with at some point, and that changes. Like we have this idea that like trans people have always been like a girl stuck in a boy's body or vice versa. It's not always the case. And I think that like gender can be fluid, and it doesn't mean that you're a different person, but it does mean that your gender has like literally changed. Sometimes it hasn't. Some people have like issue with that idea, but sometimes for me, I think mine kind of has.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the next question. How is it different for growing up for us? We're all, all in Gen Z. I think one of the difficulties in actually answering this question is it's hard to remove yourself from a generation and worldview that is now just accepted in your mind. Like it hasn't, especially in the last couple of years, like gender acceptance has gotten a lot better, but like it's hard to remove yourself from that to see it from a different perspective, like knowing what we know. Does anyone want to add to that?
I think that one thing that, like, obviously I have not grown up in any other generation. I have only grown up in my generation. But something that I can guess at, I'd say pretty accurately, is that like growing up, a lot more of my friends came out as trans or trans non-binary than kids' friends from like many other generations did. Like in this discussion group, like we have 2 people that use they them pronouns, and
3 people.
3 people that use they them pronouns. So like there's like a lot more gender diversity with this generation, I'd say, and I think a lot of that is because of people before us, like queer people before us who have like come and like kind of paved the way with like and advocated for like trans and gay rights and like in general, and like because of their advocacy we've gotten to have a lot more of these conversations about gender and different types of queerness with like when we were younger, and a lot of us have like realized that we're trans or queer in other ways at younger ages. So we've been able to have these more nuanced conversations with ourselves and our friends.
And this kind of causes a disconnect with earlier generations, which makes it harder for us to understand why some people are so stubborn, and harder for other people to understand, I guess, why we're so open. I mean, that kind of makes it seem really one-sided, but I genuinely think it is. So because we're so used to this, we kind of think it's normal once you've explored it and like thought about it. But for people that haven't yet, it can seem very alien, and that makes it a bit different with us, with especially older generations.
Yeah, real quick. I think also that there's like I think that it's easier, I guess, for us probably to understand like what previous generations thought, because those ideas are still hanging around, and even if we are growing up in a generation that's far more accepting and has done far more work to understand concepts like gender and sexuality, there's still so much of the old ways surrounding us literally all the time. So like we kind of are giving new language and new feelings and understandings about these issues that weren't really around for other generations before, even if like the same feelings were around, the language wasn't. And so I think that there is a gap, but we have like we can understand how things used to be with our newer understandings.
Yeah, just to kind of echo what everyone else was saying, I think it's really interesting to explore the dynamic within our generation, because I feel like our generation is like very unique in the way that we like approach social movements and the way that we, treat other people. etc. So it's like what growing up and like when we were little, I feel like this kind of like ties into the aspect within our conversation when we were talking about like youth and the gender and how we view, you know, that aspect at that times of our life. It seems like when we are younger, we really echo like the thoughts and opinions of our parents and like kind of what we learn at home. So it's like I noticed a lot that in in elementary school, middle school, is that there really was this like, oh, you're doing a boy thing, oh, you're doing a girl thing, or it's like if you but I feel like a lot of people just didn't necessarily like know who they were and therefore kind of resorted back to that like socially constructed idea of traditional roles for, you know, like what people consider, you know, the binary, even though the binary doesn't necessarily exist. And then I feel like as we grew up and then as we're, you know, exploring ourselves and, you know, being like more open-minded, maybe like learning more, you know, in school about like what past generations have gone through as well. And I just feel like that we have developed a lot of empathy for one another and a lot and just like become like more understanding because like as more and more people discovered who they were and started coming out, I think it's really interesting to see that it was like people weren't shaming them, but they were accepting them and like praising one another, which I think is a really amazing thing that is present within our generation that unfortunately isn't always like the case in previous generations. And I just think that like it could get really really, you know, not necessarily complicated, but like really interesting to like how and why our generation is the way like the way that we are compared to previous generations, because I feel like it is really different and I think it's an amazing kind of different that I feel like kind of gives a lot of hope for the future and how we can approach how we look about gender in the future as well.
This I think kind of ties together, relates to what Kishi was saying and Anna Marie. I think part of it is that we kind of as children echo what our parents think, but I think it's also really significant that we as Gen Z, it's not just that we're living in this unprecedented era of like new attitudes towards gender, it's that we've like seen them change within our lifetimes. Like I was born in 2004, gender, like kids' toys, kids' everything, and I think life in general was still very, very gendered, like to the extent I think, or like close to the extent it was in my parents' generation in the 2000s. It's like I've grown up and watched as like gender neutral bathrooms became a thing like for trans people that were normalized and not just like some places happen to have them. And like as pronouns became a normal thing to just introduce yourself with. And so I think we have this very unique perspective of like that it's easier obviously to acquire new like information as a kid, but we've also like kind of had to grow into these new things ourselves too, as we've also not spearheaded them, but to an extent been at like the driving force. At least I would say it's definitely perceived that way, you know.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that like all social issues, you know, are gradual and that these are the issues that we face in our time, but the next few generations will most likely face completely different issues, and the previous generations have faced, you know, different issues. I think, you know, generally we, as you know, we get more accepting in some ways and less accepting in others, and it's just about, you know, the specific people and, you know, generational, you know, differences are helpful but aren't always absolute. Like, you know, we are a group of people who are very accepting, but there are other people in our generation who have grown up in the same world that we have who are very not accepting at all. Yeah, okay. And then moving on to the next question. Gender is a social category. How does individual identity relate to a social category like this?
I think the most important thing to think about is that gender is really just related to stereotypes. I guess so. I mean, there's the extremes, right? As a kid, you feel like you're girly, or, and there's stereotypes with that. Same for boys. And I think with it being individual, it's something that it's the way you feel about yourself, and then you try to put yourself in a societal category, which is why obviously it is flawed, especially in this day and age. But but the whole point is it's as an individual, you're trying to fit into society or into a group of in society.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I think gender like as a social idea is kind of like what we were talking about earlier. And I think gender as an identity is how you present yourself, kind of either, or like maybe not even necessarily how you present yourself. I think that might be part of gender identity. I think gender identity is definitely like defined by the self for the self. And I don't think anything can change that. But I think a lot of people use presentation to try to express how they feel about their gender identity. And so they use gender presentation. They express their gender within like the social idea of gender, to try to like show the world like how they feel. And I think that in like sort of the more ideal society that we were talking about earlier, people like would be able to do that without really any social repercussions. And I think that is where we run into the most problems currently.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a very Stephen question. I think like as a social category, it can be, it can create a sense of community like most social categories. And then it can also create the sense of alienation from other different things in the category. And that like it is like, I think for a lot of people, it's like it can be a sort of important building block to their identity. For me, it certainly is. And like, even though, like Charles said, it's sort of based upon these gender roles and these stereotypes that create like the coding of gender, they can also like create that sense of community, not necessarily through gender roles, but through like a mutual understanding of how those stereotypes don't really exist, but how they also, like, not stereotypes, but how like it, like how they view themselves and how other people view them can sort of tie everything together. Sorry, that didn't make too much sense.
No, that was great. I think we have time for one more question. Is being non-binary making a totally different kind of claim about the meaning of gender than being trans?
I am. I think like it's, it is it's weird to say that it's making a claim since it is sort of just being a person, but in this stage, like, yeah, it is sort of when you have to think about it, it is sort of making a claim to some people about like what gender is. And it's a sort of, because like gender is viewed as binary, it has been for many years in a lot of the world. It's like, I forgot the question.
It was just that, is being non-binary, like it essentially the question is being non-binary incongruent with being trans? Like
it's not incongruent with being trans, because I think, non-binary people are under the trans umbrella, right? So they're also people who transition from the gender they were assigned at birth, however way that may be. But it is like the way it sort of goes about can definitely be, I think, very different from how people who transition in the binary can experience gender. I think there's a very like set path, even though being trans is also a new thing, there's a very set path to like being trans in the binary. People don't always get these things, they don't have to, but people expect like gender reaffirming surgery and hormone replacement therapy, and for them to change the way they like dress and stuff and talk, and all these things, because there is like, because being a man or being a woman is something that is clear cut sort of in our society, and like how we understand that is very clear cut. Being non-binary really isn't. And so I think that there is a variety in how people transition and what transitioning means to them. And, you know, there may be no like medically transitioning involved, or there might be. And like the fact that medical transitions are often associated with like binary transitioning, I think can be, at least in my experience, it's been sort of like off-putting. Like the idea of getting top surgery is like kind of frightening, because it is like sort of a very clear step in one direction when I don't necessarily want to sway either way. I think that I sort of answered the question already, and I'm just going on, but
Yeah, I think, like you said, Kishi, it's important to think of being trans and being non-binary as under the same umbrella. While they're different, they like, you know, they have similar ideas within them. There is a similar like, you know, feeling of not really connecting with the gender you were assigned with. And I think that like, while the expression is very different, the outcome is necessarily very similar.
yeah. And to sort of complete my thought, is that just like I think that even though there is this set path and expectations, none of those things, like medically transitioning in one way or another, is not necessarily in reality like a defining characteristic of any trans or non-binary person. Not transitioning medically is not inherently tied to that. And I think that moving forward, something that would be interesting to see is if and how different methods of transitioning sort of are explored in different gender categories.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That is all the time we have. Thanks everyone for coming out. And Amy, do you have any last things to say?
Sure. I just wanted to thank you all for being part of this panel. Thanks to everyone who joined us for this discussion. It was really interesting and wonderful to hear all of your perspectives. So thanks again. Stephen, do you have any closing remarks, or shall we?
I guess the one thing I would say is that I agree, this was really wonderful, but most students don't get an opportunity to be involved in this kind of thing. And so I would call for people to join the effort to bring philosophy to younger people. And the Committee on Pre-College Instruction, Philosophy, and Plato both are ways to get involved to try and to make it so that the opportunities that these students have had become more commonplace. Thanks for coming, Evan.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks to Plato for co-sponsoring. And this session has been recorded and will be available on the APA website in a few days. And the link is apaonline.org/on-demand, where you can find recordings of past webinars as well. And one final plug to put in suggestions for topics for future APA Live events. There's a URL on the screen for that as well. So thanks again. Really appreciate your time, and especially the panelists for all of your great discussion. It was really wonderful. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you again at a future APA Live event. Take care, everybody.